recap series, whatever you like to call it. Part 1 of this series will be on the generation as a whole, and then the subsequent videos will be on the individual consoles you see in front of you, of which there are 5. Now, the thing about the second video game generation is there are actually 14 consoles, and I don't own the vast majority of them, so I'm going to just do videos on the ones I have. If I get some of them later, I'll be happy to add them in. You know how that goes from time to time. The one I want the most, of course, is the Vectrex. I'd love to do one on the Vectrex, but sadly don't have one. So yeah, that's what we're going to do this time around. And then I also want to say we're kind of going out with a bang here a little bit, because there probably won't be a traditional first generation recap series, only because that generation, I don't know how much you guys know about it, but long and the short of it, there was a game called Pong. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And that game was essentially just put into like 1,000 different little boxes by different companies and then released that way. And that's really every single console was that. It was just a Pong box. I have a couple of them. Maybe we'll do one big video on all of them or something like that. But beyond that, there's not going to be individual breakdowns because it's just not really interesting enough. But let's enjoy the second generation, shall we? Now, the second generation, I think, is really interesting because it's essentially the Wild West era of video games. Now we live in a highly regulated and highly understood gaming industry world, whereby you have a lot of things that you take kind of as granted, but they weren't granted back then. Like, for example, quality control standards. That wasn't a thing. Things like releasing your console in all these different countries at the same time, or relatively the same time. Basic concepts like updating your hardware. And I don't mean like just software updates or anything like that. I mean like, oh look, I'm Atari, I have a console, it's been a few years, it's time to upgrade and make a new one. That wasn't a thing back then that people understood. You know, the idea that you shouldn't directly steal from your competitors, the idea that you should probably have some sort of like anti-piracy measures in your console, stuff like that, poof, did not exist back then. One thing that really didn't exist that's fascinating is the entire concept of console generations. See, you might think, well, that's the second generation, so they knew it was a new generation because there was new hardware. That's how it works. Generations are defined very oddly. The common misconception with generations is they typically are defined by a new piece of technology creating a new generation. That's part of it, but it's also part timing, it's also part the history. There's a lot of different factors that go in that make it really hard to define a clear border. Retroactively, there was a border defined between what we now know to be the first generation and the second generation, basically separating the Pong clones away from everything else, and then a border between this generation and like the third generation, you know, the NES, Master System, Atari 7800, stuff like that. But it's not as simple as some company made a new machine and therefore it's a new generation. I mean, like I said, Atari did the 2600 in this generation. They also did the 5200. That was the first time that had happened, where one company released 2 different consoles in the same generation. And I don't mean like, oh, there's a slim model. I mean like this is, you know, more horsepower. This essentially would be a next-gen console, but it simply wasn't because it just wasn't defined that way yet. And it wasn't even the last time that happened. Most recently, SNK did that with the Neo Geo AES and the Neo Geo CD, both showing up in the same, the fourth generation. And so it's not unprecedented. And it might be happening again now, at the time I make this video anyway. We might be defining the PS4 Pro as an 8th gen console, even though it's beefier. Scorpio might be the same thing, Nintendo Switch. We might have this weird thing where the concept of 2 consoles in the same generation is happening. That's a debate for another time. But I'm just saying there is precedent, historical precedent for that kind of concept occurring. So let's talk more about the second video game generation as a whole. Like I said, man, Wild West. No rules. It was insane. Basically what had happened is that Pong clone stuff had been relatively successful, and different companies thought, you know, there's something to this. You know, we can make some money on this. But people didn't know if it was just going to be a fad or if it was going to be something that would last forever. A lot of people certainly thought of it as a fad because you had all sorts of companies getting involved in video games that you really wouldn't expect. Like Atari is the most famous one. Everybody knows them. And they built around that. But then there was companies like Magnavox that was essentially a television manufacturer. Mattel, they made Barbies, and they still do. They're a toy company. Coleco was kind of they made like Cabbage Patch Kids. So they were a toy company, but also kind of an electronics company at the same time, and they made a video game console. And then there's all sorts of other ones that did as well. So you had a lot of people just trying to get in there, and you had a lot of people who were also just trying to make games to just kind of get a quick buck out of it. Very famously, companies like Purina Dog Food were making video games for the Atari 2600 because Atari had no way to police it. You can't do that, and that's one of those things that was, again, defined by the consequence of this generation. And make sure we all are on the same page here. They didn't go into this generation being like, all right, guys, let's get together and make industry rules and we're all going to get along. It's like, no. What happened was the entire industry fucking crashed and was destroyed. And there was this massive forest fire, essentially, to get rid of all the deadwood. And out of that, they were like, okay, we should come up with a couple of basic rules. And that's when you had the video game crash in 1983. Nintendo came in 1985 with the NES, basically wrote all the new rules that we still use to this day. The video game crash could have completely destroyed video games entirely, not just in North America. I know a lot of Europeans love to point out, oh, no, that didn't affect us over here. In the short term, no. Long term, it most definitely would have. And it did ultimately because of all the rules Nintendo created about quality control, anti-piracy measures, global marketing, all that stuff came as a direct result of all of the mistakes that have been made in this generation. And that certainly did affect everyone who's into video games still to this day. Like even now, you think about the amount of game consoles and stuff you have. You have 3 primary console makers, and then of course you have PCs. So you basically have like 4 options, plus things like handhelds. And sure, every once in a while you get, your NVIDIA Shields and your Ouya's and stuff like that, but that stuff's never taken too seriously. Back then, it was so insane because you had no idea who to take seriously. I mean, like I said, I got 5 of these things in front of me. There's 9 more I don't have. And a lot of them are from completely legitimate companies. It's like, you didn't know back then if you were buying a console if it was going to last, 20 years or if it was going to last 10 minutes. You didn't know any of that. And basically what happened with the crash was there was just too many choices, too many bad games, no way to really, police any of that stuff so that you could see what was going to be good, what was going to be bad. You couldn't really rent stuff, and customers just got royally burned. And that's why the whole industry came crashing down. But like I said, it taught us a lot about how the future should go for video games. And I think that's fascinating that all of that just happened. And as a result, you got some really bizarre and weird, unique pieces of hardware out of it. One other thing that's about this generation that's obviously very cool is it essentially introduced us all to the concept of changing the game. Now back then, like I said, the first generation, it was all basically Pong clones, with the exception of like the Magnavox Odyssey. Not this is the Odyssey 2. But the Magnavox Odyssey was the first console to use any sort of cartridges. But the cartridges were incredibly basic, and they just had very slight variation based on like the kind of game you were trying to play. Like one would be hockey, and one would be basketball and stuff like. And all it would do is just change the way the light pattern worked. It was a very, very basic change, but it was technically the first time that it happened. This generation introduced us to like, hey, you can put a cartridge in this thing and it'll be, a Spider-Man game, or it'll be Pac-Man, or it'll be Space Invaders, like completely different games based on whatever that game was. You didn't have to rebuy the hardware every single time, you just had to buy the new game. That is still obviously a concept we use now. You have the hardware and you just have to buy new games for it. So you kind of have to thank this generation for that entire concept, which is really very cool. On a more personal level, one thing that's fascinating about this generation to me, and this is unique to everybody individually, is that this was the only real video game generation that happened without my existence. It started before I was born and ended before I was born. Obviously, I wasn't around for the first generation either, but as you kind of can tell, I don't consider that one to be too much of like an interesting video game generation, because it was essentially the same machine and the same game over and over again. This was unique experiences throughout, and the only way I can learn about it is retroactively. I can only study it through the hardware, having acquired it years later, studying it through history books, which by that I mean the internet, or studying it through like other people's stories.
Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Korlick with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here. Alright, so here's what I want to do. I am going to make a mini-series kind of thing about the 7th generation of game consoles, which just ended, as all of you know, I'm sure. This video is just going to be about, like, generally the 7th generation. I'm not going to talk too much about each console. And then I'll do separate videos on each one of them, so you're looking at a total of 4 videos here. So hopefully you stay tuned and you enjoy them.
But let's kick it off by just talking about, in general, what we gained from the 7th generation, what we lost in the 7th generation, and, interesting little trivia about it, that kind of thing. So